Hello, you're tuned to Resilience Radio. I'm Irvin Eisenberg, host of the show and owner of Resilience Occupational Therapy. As always, none of this is meant to be medically diagnostic or prescriptive in any way. Everyone's got their own unique health, and I just like to showcase a variety of different guests. Additionally, I don't necessarily agree with everything my guests say, so take it all with a grain of salt. But a further disclaimer is today's guest has a product that I do endorse, and I'm currently sitting on. For those in the video, they might see me wobbling, but it is one of these QOR360 chairs. In any case, the guest for those of you on video are already seeing Dr. Osler, Turner Osler. So excited to have you on today. You're the creator or co-creator of the QOR360.
Yeah, I am. I'm credited with inventing the mechanism that makes it work. But really, it's a confluence of very talented people that I was lucky enough to meet here in Burlington that have a maker space that embraces washed-up trauma surgeons who, are new to the whole R&D and entrepreneurial space. So there've been a lot. I've had a lot of help, but I'm the titular CEO.
Okay, so let's jump into your story. I gather it's an interesting one. Not often do you hear of trauma surgeons finding their way into ergonomic chairs. So I feel like there's a lot in between there.
No, it seems bizarre, and it's certainly not at all what I had planned, but it's a quick story to tell because, the first 30 or 40 years I spent, in studying neurophysiology and then medical school and then surgical residency and then 3 fellowships and then 20 or 30 years taking care of trauma patients and teaching surgical residents at first the University of New Mexico and then the last 30 years here at the University of Vermont. So, that just goes by in the blink of an eye. But as I started to age out of operating all night as a trauma surgeon, I got a master's degree in biostat, started doing epidemiology. And it was interesting because instead of running around all day as first the ICU, then the ER, then the OR, that kind of stuff, I was just writing code all day. And I found it quite uncomfortable to be sitting in front of a computer, which is the way much of America spends their lives. And I just, hadn't lived that life. And so I thought, well, surely, we can find some chair that'll make this better. And I started looking around and I was appalled at what passes for ergonomic science, that the people who are in charge of, our furniture really don't have any science chops. They have no background in that kind of thing. And I took way too deep a dive. I read all the papers that were written. I started going to ergonomic conferences, listening to their scientific presentations. These guys are just showing pie charts to each other. They not a randomized control study to be found. And so, I was kind of amazed that it's a multi-billion-dollar industry that isn't built on any knowledge base. So one thing led to another, and I finally decided that there were no chairs that were really worth having. So I have to just invent one, which is an act of hubris because, I had a patent on a slide rule, but I never really built any moving furniture. That was and I surely would have failed, except as I mentioned, there's a nice, very congenial maker community here in Burlington, Vermont. And they were delighted to take in some, refugee from academic surgery and kind of give me the tools and the help I needed to kind of, work to build a better kind of chair. So, and then it turned out that, because I could read the medical literature and because I understood statistics and analysis, I was the kind of person who could help tell this story. So we set up a website and I started writing a blog. And, now we've sold 16,000 chairs around the world. Initially out of our basement here in Burlington, Colchester, Vermont. And now we have a warehouse in Morristown that kind of boxes and ships stuff for us. So it's a long way from, neurophysiology, but every step kind of made sense.
So what it seems like there might be a couple steps in there that are being glossed over.
Sure.
You knew that you knew you didn't have a chair that you wanted to for the research you're on. You started researching what was out there and didn't like what was there. What made you make that jump to say, okay, well, I'm going to build it?
Well, I just bought every chair, and they were all terrible. The kneeling chair, the yoga ball, all of these ergonomic chairs, and then the rest of them were basically all the same. The headrest, the backrest, the armrest, the footrest, the lumbar support, all of that kind of. It was basically they were just making the same chair over and over again, but putting more chrome on it and charging more for it. Our core idea was that propping people up in an ergonomic chair with lots of braces holding them up was exactly the wrong approach. Because the human body, for the last, depends on where you start counting human, but let's say 300,000 years has been basically in constant motion. We were hunter-gatherers, we were walking miles a day, and the business of just being still all day is a metabolic catastrophe. Our metabolism is expecting that we're going to walk several miles a day. When all of your muscles suddenly go electrochemically dark for 8 hours a day, your biochemical milieu, your milieu intérieur, just kind of falls apart. Your bad cholesterol goes up, your good cholesterol goes down, your insulin goes up, and your all-cause mortality goes up. Epidemiologists are very clear that in people who sit 8 hours a day lose, on average, 2 life years.
Cool.
This is an immense loss. The cancer people tell us that if we could cure cancer today, every form of cancer, we would, on average, add 2 life years to the population of the United States. Because mostly older people get cancer and aren't going to live that long anyway. But the core idea is that 2 life years added to each life is an immense benefit. And if we could get that just by changing the chairs we sit on, it would be, make any epidemiologist proud to be part of that project. And so, our design challenge was to make a chair that would be delicately balanced so that you pretty much had to stay muscularly engaged in order to stay seated, which would bring up your metabolic rate 20 and maybe 30% halfway to walking. And at the same time require people to sit in a balanced posture with their head balanced over their C1, C2, and in a balanced, comfortable way. So we get kind of a twofer out of having a seat that's just subtly moving. You get people to sit with better posture, and you bump up their metabolic rate. Two huge wins. But the real design challenge was to make something that was delicately balanced so that it would tip in all directions, but tough enough for, the gym bros who wanted to work out on it and not pull it apart. And there have been other chairs that tip subtly or not so subtly that have been built, but ours was, based on a geometric solid that I discovered. It's the volume of intersection of 2 cylinders at right angles with non-coincident axes and possibly different radii. Think of the space of overlap of 2 cylinders touching at right angles. Because it has this biconvex surface that can rock in 2 different directions that are 90 degrees opposed, simply sliding this under the seat pan of a chair lets a chair move in all directions. We injection mold these built in Vermont, and it turns out you can own a shape. We have a patent on this shape. Archimedes sniffed around, but he missed it. He always had coincident axes when he was studying the problem of intersecting cylinders. So this is the root technology of our chairs that lets them tip rather in a delicate way and still be robust enough to stand up to decades of people rocking on them.
So it has an axis. The anchor point is just a couple of inches below the person,
Right. We
versus some of the
tried
chairs are
hard to
much
get
lower
it.
than that.
We tried hard to get the tippy point as close to the tip of the coccyx as we could. And so it's basically 3 inches away. And so it's perceived as your pelvis moving rather than as your chair moving.
Mhm. And can you compare that with some of the other tippy chairs that have a lower anchor point?
Right. So the way that's easy to make such a thing would be like the swapper, which has its tippy point on the floor. So basically, it's a seat on a pole, and so people are moving through space like in a rocking chair. Whereas if by bringing the tippy point right up underneath the coccyx, then it's the pelvis that's tipping rather than the whole body moving through space. It's a completely different feeling and has completely different metabolic consequences, and also postural consequences. The seat on a pole, people quite easily slump. When you're sitting on when you're balanced on your ischial tuberosities with a tippy point just an inch or two away, it really does kind of bring you into a balanced upright posture. Incidentally, your posture is brilliant. It might have been that way before you ran into our chair, but still.
Well, I've gone through plenty of structural integration sessions, but definitely the chair encourages it to come out. I've noticed.
And that's really the point, is that, anytime if you invent a chair and it needs an owner's manual, it's a failure. The thing I like about our chair, and we've done this experiment many, many times. We take our chairs out to Church Street, the walking street in Burlington, Vermont, just kind of put them out on a sunny day, and people walk by and sit down on them. And for a moment, they're trying to figure out what's going on as they find their balance. And then, very quickly, their sternum comes up, their head comes back, their shoulders come down, and they're sitting with a very, balanced, almost noble meditation posture. And then the next thing that happens is they whirl around, they say, "You're trying to make my posture better, aren't you?" No, it's not me. It's you. When people's pelvis is set free, then their spinal reflexes are in conversation with gravity. And it takes kids years to learn how to walk. Some of them, they spend all this time. What is the deal? Are they lazy, or are they? The deal is, it's very difficult to have bipedal locomotion in gravity. It's a very complicated thing to do. And kids have to program their spinal reflexes by crawling and then toddling and then finally walking in order to, get on with life as a child and an adult. So the business of developing the spinal reflexes that let you move smoothly through gravity takes years of programming of the spinal reflexes. All of that is available, but pretty much turned off when you're slumped in an ergonomic chair. But if you make the seat pan unstable, all of that careful programming and machinery is turned back on, and people just settle into a natural, balanced, upright posture that uses their core muscles and cranks out more calories.
So, comparing this with a standing desk.
Mm-hmm.
There's definitely
people
have standing desks, or the switches between seated and standing desks, and what do you have? What does this have that a standing desk doesn't?
No, it's an excellent question. It comes up all the time. People say, well, if sitting is bad, then standing must be good, because standing is the opposite of sitting. It seems like a syllogism, but that's not correct, because standing is not the opposite of sitting. If you watch people at a standing desk, they're not like doing Tai Chi. They lock a hip and they kind of lean in, and they're stuck for the rest of the day. If you measure their basal metabolic rate, it hardly changes from sitting because they aren't moving. I would say the opposite of sitting is moving, not standing. And there are a host of other problems that come with standing desks. I've talked to a lot of people about this. I remember one woman was almost in tears. She said, I try so hard to stand at my standing desk 8 hours a day, but it hurts so much. And I thought, boy, this is like worse than awful, because not only is it not doing her any good, but now it's also made her feel like a failure because she can't manage to stand up all day. This is a terrible thing to do to people. It turns out that if you read the Geneva Accords, making people stand for 8 hours is a war crime, right? I mean, people aren't designed to stand still. It's extremely uncomfortable. So, the standing desk doesn't solve any problems because it actually keeps people from moving. And then there's this. In 2019, a paper published in the American Journal of Epidemiology by a group in Canada. Huge study by these standards. They followed 12,000 people for 10 years. Immensely expensive and difficult kind of study to do. Half of them were standing, half of them were sitting. And when they broke the code and studied the data, what they found was that people who had been standing had twice the heart attack rate. Let that land for a minute. Standing was supposed to be better for people, and yet they had more cardiac problems. And I've published over 300 peer-reviewed papers, and I review for a couple of surgical journals. I know how to read papers. And when you read the discussion section of this paper, you can tell they were just gobsmacked. They did not expect to find that standing would be worse for people than sitting, because sitting is pretty bad for your heart. We've known that since the 1950s, when they compared the bus drivers who were sitting all day to the bus drivers who were running up and down the stairs in the double-decker buses in London. We've known that sitting is bad for people for 70 years. But now it turns out that standing is even worse. And you can just see that the wheels turning as they were trying to understand what their data was telling them. And the best they could say was, well, when you stand, it's not like walking, because when you walk, your muscles are contracting and squeezing the deep veins inside your legs and propelling blood, up the deep veins to the vena cava back to your heart. When you stand still, that blood just pools and stretches all the deep veins. And that has a couple of consequences. One is, because the blood is pooling, blood isn't a fluid, it's an organ. And when it sits around, it says, oh, maybe I'm bleeding. I think we should start clotting. And so the coagulation profile changes in people who are standing still. So that's one problem. Another problem is that when you're standing for a long period of time, there's a column of blood that goes from your right atrium right down to your feet. So it's like 2 meters of, meter and a half of blood pressure stretching the veins and the deep veins in your legs. The way the veins work is they have valves in them, so that when the muscle contracts, the blood squirts up and then the valve slams shut and the blood stays. It's a very cool mechanism. Maybe 20 or 30% of the blood circulation is done by muscular activity. Not often talked about because the heart is so easy to see and feel, but moving also moves blood around. But when you stand still with a column of blood stretching the vein, eventually it stretches the valves enough that they become incompetent. Now the pressure just goes right down to your ankles. And this is the origin of varicose veins. As a workaday surgeon, I pulled out miles of varicose veins from patients who came in, with the problems that varicose veins can cause. It's an ugly operation that you'd prefer not to have. It's commonly seen because people spend a lot of time standing on assembly lines, and then it kind of vanished from epidemiology and surgical practice because people were sitting. But with people at standing desks, I think we're going to see a resurgence in varicose veins, and that kind of surgery is going to come back into vogue. A whole generation of surgeons didn't learn how to do that operation. They'll have to watch some YouTube videos or something.
So one more type of desk or sitting that I wanted to discuss before stepping into a couple of other statements, but the yoga chair, or this is a yoga ball. Plenty of people have those. They're probably a lot cheaper than this chair. What's the advantages or disadvantages of that versus sitting versus a standard sitting option versus your chair?
No, I wrote a blog about that in 2017, and I was just kind of reworking it in light of newer data that's come along. the yoga ball seems like an obvious solution. Balls had been around in medical practice since the 1950s. They were first used in neonatal ICUs as a way to tip tiny babies around to drain their lungs so they wouldn't need to be intubated and get pneumonia and stuff like that. It was just a way to move a baby around that didn't require much effort. And they found some other uses, rehab after childbirth and stuff like that. And then this guy in Italy in 1963 figured out a way to make really big inflatable yoga balls with an injection molding process. And they were initially pitched as exercise things for a gymnasium and so on, and really kind of got big. I mean, they were inexpensive to make and they were kind of cool. And then, just as the yoga balls were catching on in gymnasiums, there was a growing awareness that the business of sitting at your desk all day was bad for people. And so the light bulb came on and said, wait a minute, yoga balls are about the right height and they're healthy, and sitting at your desk is unhealthy. So let's just bring yoga balls into the workspace. So it was a oh yeah kind of moment, because they're healthy and sitting is unhealthy, so fine. And it makes sense on paper, I guess you'd say, but there are a host of problems when you actually come to trying to sit on a yoga ball. The first is that you can't adjust the height, and the height of your chair is crucially important how the rest of your posture is going to be organized. There have been attempts to try and make yoga balls adjustable, but it's pretty complicated and hasn't really worked out very well. You can buy them in different sizes, but these are pretty big gradations, and you expect to be able to adjust your chair height by millimeters, not by 6-inch increments. So that's the first thing, is you can't adjust the height. The second thing is that in order to sit, you have to be able to balance on your ischial tuberosities. You have to be able to find a point in space but that you're going to balance your spine and your head over. And a yoga ball doesn't really offer any resistance where you can find a center to balance your posture on. And so in practice, you watch people on a yoga ball, and they'll sit up for a little while, and very quickly they'll just fall into a slump. Their pelvis will roll backwards, and they'll just be in a C-shaped slump, and they won't find their way out. So the hope was that it would get people to move around, but it turns out you only move on a yoga ball when you mean to. If you just sit there, what happens is you fall into a slump, and then you really don't move. So that's a second problem with yoga balls. Another problem, and I learned this at an ergonomic conference. I was talking to the head of HR at the university, for the University of Michigan, and she told me that they had banned yoga balls through their entire university. 34,000 employees, 0 yoga balls, because they had 5 instances where the yoga ball had popped and somebody had gone to ground. And even if you've done martial arts, if you're deep in a spreadsheet and suddenly the thing you're sitting on doesn't exist, most people just go to ground. They had one guy with a head injury who needed to have burr holes drilled in the OR. It's a problem. And she left me with this piece of wisdom. She said, often you won't be able to get yoga balls out because it's complicated. But what you should do is you should require all the yoga balls in your organization be put in a dumpster on January 1st and buy all new. Because as yoga balls age, the plasticizer that keeps the plastic flexible evaporates, they become brittle, and that's when they crack and fall down.
I've seen some YouTube video of people taking scissors to yoga balls, and
Right.
the newer yoga balls, when you hit them with the scissors, they deflate.
Right.
Versus the older
right.
ones would just pop on you.
Right. There's new
have a moment to catch.
Yeah, the yoga ball community is aware of this problem. So there's new tech now where they have some structure inside that makes it lose air more slowly, because they filled up the inside with stuff that keeps the air from moving immediately out the hole. But now your yoga ball got more expensive, and so on. So it's interesting how in the United States malpractice litigation really drives innovation. So enough people got hurt on yoga balls that finally the yoga ball community had to figure out a way to make a ball that wouldn't just go to ground. But if you go to the yoga studio, 5 miles from where I am, they're still selling the plastic ones with no special non-leak stuff built in. So I guess I would say if you're going to buy a yoga ball, be sure it's one that doesn't have the instant collapse issue.
Or at least get a new one
Yeah,
annually or whatever.
or replace it each year. They're cheap enough that you can replace them each year. I mean, and they're cheap to ship because they fold up quite small. But from my perspective, they fail because you can't get the height right, and you can't get your posture right on top of it. So the reasons you were reaching out for some alternative to the chair that you have, those are two of the most important reasons, and the yoga ball fails. The business of having it pop underneath you is like a whole different sort of issue, and the yoga ball manufacturers have kind of tumbled to, we got to solve this or we're going to get sued out of existence. And I had kind of thought yoga balls were going away because you just don't see them around that much anymore. But if you dive into the ergonomics of them, they're still making them and still selling them. And but they only amount to about 2% of the office chair market. So it's definitely a niche product.
So I listened, and I wish I had remembered who this scientist was, but I think it was a Terry Gross interview or some NPR interview with a biological anthropologist who was talking about cultural norms. He was talking about modern day. He was talking about historical peoples, current indigenous peoples, and he was looking at primate studies. And he was pushing back against the statement, sitting is the new smoking, saying that we don't sit more than we used to, was his claim, that we just sit differently than we used to.
Right. But it's the way that we sit that makes it more like indigenous people smoked, but not much, because a lot of darn trouble to get tobacco and build a pipe and this and that and the other thing. So it didn't adversely impact their health because they didn't smoke that much. But when we developed mass manufacture of cigarettes, we created a completely different sort of problem because now people could chain smoke, something that indigenous people never did. So by changing the implementation of something, you can profoundly change what its impact is. So, but indigenous peoples, hunter-gatherers, we'll take the Hadza in Tanzania as like the representative group because they're about the only ones left. They spend as much time lounging around as any cubicle rat in Manhattan does. But crucially, they aren't sitting slumped in a Herman Miller Aeron chair. They're squatting. And squatting turns out to be a whole different ballgame because it keeps them muscularly engaged while they're it's called an active rest posture is the technical term that's used by anthropologists. And it makes a huge difference in their metabolism and in their posture. And I love this can't remember, some anthropologic biologist at Harvard. What is his name? Will come to me later. Says they took a bunch of equipment out to study the Hadza, and they brought with them some camp chairs for themselves. And these hunter-gatherers who've been squatting quite happily for 300,000 years, landed on the camp chairs as quick as they could and just loved sitting. They were as vulnerable to the seduction of sitting in a slumped chair as all those Manhattanites are. They just hadn't been adequately tempted because they had no technology and they had no furniture. So it's not that they're spiritually perfect. It's just they didn't have the corrupting influence of Herman Miller and Steelcase tempting them with these chairs that are really bad for them. Just as tobacco companies tempted people with cheap cigarettes that were terrible for them.
I think the particular anthropologist that I was listening to was attributing it to another technological innovation, which was during the Industrial Revolution, the development of the cafe chair put a back to the chair. Before then, it was only royalty that sat with the back chairs, and he was saying that just having that back support just caused us to lean back and do that. Now, it seems like, and his statement was that there was straight up sitting, but people were getting up to tend the fire occasionally, even if they were sitting for 16 hours a day. And even if they were sitting and not squatting, that they were moving differently and they didn't have the back support. And here, on the chair I'm on, I have the tiniest bit of sacral support because this has a curve, so I don't fall off the back of the chair. And just hold this up for those who, so I'm talking about it here. It has the tiniest bit of back support here, but one thing that I'm finding interesting is that it's still, because you're sitting still, even though it's rocking in different directions. What I'm finding in sitting on it for a while is that it simulates a lot of types of movement. I feel that my SI joint can shift, which is great, and I could talk ad nauseum about the SI joint, but I can feel that my feet have to engage, which means that I can easily stand up again, and that balance I feel that, and all of that makes my structures stack up and be actively engaged. The one thing it doesn't seem to do, which standing and walking don't always do either, is it seems like it's not calling on the pelvic floor the same way. And I don't have a solution to that. But there is by the nature of it still being flat on the bottom, there is something about the pelvic floor is still just sort of resting there. Now it's better because the structures around the pelvic floor are still shifting some and are upright versus just caved in. But that would be my only sort of, and I have no idea what the solution to that is, but my only sort of nitpicky misgiving about it, aside from the fact that for my bony butt, the lighter chair that you have, the first one, I've got the version 2 meant for heavier set people. For the lighter chair, that my sits bones would get pretty sore after a little bit. So I appreciate the increased padding of the heavier chair.
No, it's as a design guy, it's very tough to know how soft to make a chair, because those Presbyterians, they'll sit on wood, for a 2-hour church service, and other people, want elaborate padding. And so we're trying to dial in enough padding to keep people comfortable, but not so much padding that they can't feel their sitting bones. And it's very hard to make that adjustable. So we said, okay, fine, we'll have a chair that's firmer for people who want to be able to feel their sitting bones more distinctly. And we'll have one with more padding for people who, want to be able to sit all day and not have to think about their sitting bones. So, we just basically had to design 2 different chairs, and it's simple enough. You just make the seat a little bigger and make the padding a little thicker, and that is. But people have come to expect a really soft chair, and so when you try and you don't want to get too far ahead of your market, or you don't have a market. So just to say, moving in that crazy direction, this is we were trying to design a chair that would be, inexpensive enough that everybody could have one. So we got rid of everything that you didn't have to have to get a chair to work. And we took a chance.
And which one is it that you're showing there?
Say again?
Which chair is that you're showing there?
We call it the Tilt. It's on our website, but we took a real chance on it. We said, we're not going to put any foam in the seat. We're going to put in buckwheat hulls, like a Zen meditation cushion. The Zen guys have been sitting on this kind of stuff for, I don't know, thousands of years. It's really firm, and I really like it, but definitely not for everybody, probably.
Okay. Well, I feel like there's more we certainly can discuss, and we'll follow up and have another video right after this. But this seems like a good place to wrap up this part of the discussion. I really appreciate you coming on and taking the time to talk about this
And
quite innovative product.
my wife thanks you, because after I get this out of my system, we can talk about something else at dinner tonight. So she's very grateful to you for getting this out of me.
Well, we offer multiple services here.
Marital counseling.
Well, thank you again.
Thanks so much, Irvin.
You've been listening to or watching, and depending on the case, Resilience Radio with Turner Osler talking about his QOR360 chair. If you want more information about this, check out the show notes. I've got an affiliate link with them, and you can check out the product there, and feel free to reach out to me or to the company directly with any questions you have on that. The music was brought to you by Aaron Marcus with their tune Some Biological Process. You can check the show notes again for the full credits on that. And until next time, take care.